Hello, my name is Keith Broomfield. I'm a Scottish nature writer. I write weekly nature columns for the Press and Journal and Courier newspapers, as well as the Alloa Advertiser, and occasional wildlife articles for the Scotsman as well. I've also just written a new book. It's called The Scottish Wildlife Odyssey. It's a travel journey through Scotland in search of its wild secrets. And basically, I start from the southwest of the country and I zigzag my way from east to west and make my way northwards, finishing my journey in the Shetland Isles. I found the journey very uplifting, and for this talk I'm going to focus on some of the areas, some of the species I saw that really grabbed my attention and made me sit up and think about our amazing country and its wildlife. So the first place I visited was the Solway coast in Dumfriesshire. It was Calaverock, the Marsh there, which is a salt marsh, an amazing salt marsh that stretches as far as the eye could see, and it looks almost like Arctic tundra. You know, it's got the very cropped grass and lots of pools and that kind of habitat, and it also attracts an Arctic tundra living species, which is the Barnacle Goose. And that was the main quarry. That's why I wanted to visit the place, because it was a bird I didn't know very well and I wanted to find out more about them. So I still remember my arrival. It was a cold March frosty morning, and when I arrived there was a skylark singing in the sky. And skylarks, they've excited poets and writers for centuries, and they often talk about how the skylark rains down its sweet music onto the ground below. And as I watched this skylark, you could see where these writers were coming from, and also because it was moving its head from side to side, just trying to get the biggest spray of music, if you like, over the widest possible area. I've noticed that with skylarks before. They really do vent forth their music by moving their head from side to side for that big area coverage. But it was the Barnacle Geese I'd come to see, and it didn't take me long to hear them. I could hear them calling in the distance, and then soon large flocks were flying overhead, some settling down the mudflats, some settling down onto the short cropped grass to feed. They're very engaging, very charismatic geese, quite tame as well. Some of them allowed me to approach quite close. And they're kind of black and white essentially, quite a small goose, or even you could describe it as the size of a large duck. And the interesting thing about the barnacle geese that come to the Solway is the Solway holds the whole population of birds that breed in Svalbard, or Spitsbergen as it used to be known. And that just highlights just how important the Solway Firth and these salt marshes, the Marsh, is to the Svalbard population of barnacle geese. So that's about 40,000 birds, a whole breeding population of Svalbard come to the Solway to spend the winter. So, and as I say, you know, that's why, you know, conservation needs to be international. There's no point protecting one area when another area where a bird might winter or where breed comes under threat and under danger, because then the species goes forever. Very interesting birds, barnacle geese. In days past, people wondered where they went to, or, you know, when they disappeared in the spring and summer. And one theory was, and this is where the name comes from, was that they got their name because they arose from barnacles that were found drifting on driftwood. And it's quite often, you know, how these different theories arise, and it was a very common thought in the past that a lot of birds, like swallows for example, when they disappear they actually go away to hibernate, which is a perfectly feasible theory at the time when people didn't actually understand the whole principle of migration. Another thing, interesting thing about these barnacle geese, they often nest on cliffs in Svalbard, and you know, they've got predators to watch out for, particularly Arctic foxes, and when they're young, when they jump from their cliff nest down to the ground below, a very dangerous time, then a lot of youngsters will actually fall prey to Arctic foxes. Another thing I found very interesting about the barnacle geese is there's another population in Greenland, and they also winter in Scotland, but they winter in areas from Orkney down the west coast, the outer and inner Hebrides, all the way down to Islay. And these two populations, they breed in different places, they winter in different places, and never the twain do they meet. which is kind of fascinating how that kind of different evolution evolved over time. Salt marsh, the Marsh is part land, is part water, it's exposed to air for much of the time and then flooded by the highest tides. And therefore it's home to particularly unique habitat, home to specially adapted range of salt-tolerant plants such as scurvy grass, sea blight, marsh samphire and holy grass. And plants such as marsh samphire is like a small succulent type plant. It actually, when the tide comes in, the highest tide comes in, it traps some of the sediment that comes in, and that sort of creates more sediment, more soil if you like, and that helps other species to succeed, to kind of follow on and colonise the Marsh. The Solway holds around a quarter of all salt marsh found in the UK, which, you know, again, I've been going on about, you know, how important this habitat is, and it's not just the Marsh that's important. It's the mudflats offshore, which is a huge reservoir, holding a multitude of shellfish such as cockles and tellins, species like that. So it's a very rich place for birds. So that also attracts, as well as the geese, it attracts somewhere in the region of 140,000 wintering wildfowl and waders, including pintail ducks, knots, oyster catchers, bar-tailed godwits and curlews. And as well as that, the Marsh is a very important carbon sink, so it's you know, it stores carbon, so a very kind of important habitat in the whole ecology of Scotland, and one that really does desperately need to be protected. After the Marsh, I went to the Moffat Hills. That's the next stage of my journey, and here I was going to a remarkable fish refuge. So this is Loch Skene, which some of you may know it. It lies up just above the Grey Mare's Tail, and here it is a place where a fish called the Vendace, that was on the verge of extinction, has been translocated to form a new place, a new safe refuge for these fish to live in. It's a herring type fish, the Vendace. It was once a common staple of the good folk of Loch Mabon in Dumfriesshire, and it lived in Mill and Castle Lochs in Dumfriesshire. But then a combination of pressures, deterioration in water quality, non-native plants and fish causing competition and upsetting the whole ecology of these lochs, placed the Vendace into severe danger and severe threat, and it disappeared from Castle Loch in the first half of the 20th century and Mill Loch in the early 1970s, the only Scottish sites where these fish occurred. So this sparked quite a remarkable rescue operation, because there were still populations of Vendace hanging across, just hanging on across the border in Cumbria, in the Lake District, in Derwent Water and Basingthwaite. And these fish, under a species recovery plan, fertilised Vendace eggs and small fry were taken from Basingthwaite and introduced to Loch Skene, so as to provide a refuge, a place where these fish could live in Scotland. And in some ways this was just done in nick and time, because the Basingthwaite population, it was thought it had become extinct by the early 2000s. Although since then the odd fish has been turning up in Basingthwaite, so they might just be hanging on by a perilous thread, if you like. But it shows the importance, I think, you know, of translocation programs, you know, giving animals, fish, birds a helping hand where they are really struggling under very difficult circumstances. And it's very much, this was a pioneering species recovery plan. And the Vendace now have been introduced to 3 other water bodies in Scotland, Loch Earn in Perthshire, Dare Reservoir in South Lanarkshire, and Loch Valley in Galloway. And just a similarly threatened fish called the Powin, a close relative of the Vendace, which in Scotland is restricted to Loch Lomond and Loch Eich, and it's been introduced to several other lochs in central Scotland and Argyll as well, so as to give it a helping hand for survival. And of course we've seen how in birds such schemes have worked as well, with red kites, and nearby Loch Skene in Moffat Hills, golden eagles are being reintroduced with some success, and hopefully that will boost a population which is only like about 3 pairs just now, that could easily support up to 16 pairs in the whole of the south of Scotland. My wildlife journey then took me to Berwickshire, and where there were crooning eiders and grey seals in the water, then across the Ayr Gorge woodlands, which had its own range of woodland species, and spring plants were coming out into flower, and then Loch Winnick, where I saw great crested grebes and other waterfowl. But then my next destination is probably the most amazing wildlife sites, or most unusual wildlife sites I've ever been to, and that's the East End of Glasgow. Because there lives an amazing population of water voles. But the incredible thing about these water voles is they don't live by water. They actually live underground. They live a fossorial existence. They live in grasslands. They spend most of the winter underground, where they'll be nibbling the roots of plants and seeking shelter under the ground. But they'll maybe live more on the surface during the summertime. So this is a very unusual way for water voles to behave in the UK. There are fossorial underground living populations in other parts of Europe, but in the UK it's only been very rarely recorded. And these water voles, they were just first discovered in Glasgow's East End in 2008. And we don't know whether these have been water-living water voles that have then adapted to a new lifestyle, perhaps because of the building of the nearby M8 motorway in the 1950s, or the building up of urbanisation in the Glasgow's East End during the 50s, 60s, 70s and the 80s. But what we do know is there's a very interesting population of water voles that have come under some study. And of course the water vole, it's a species under threat. It's undergone catastrophic decline, perhaps of 90%, due to habitat loss and also predation by the introduced species, the American mink. Now these water voles, of course, they don't live by water. American mink live by water, and therefore they're safe from that kind of predation, and that may be one reason why they thrive, and also because they live underground, so that they're not so exposed to predators. Although they do face a danger of being dug out by dogs, or actually people living in the East End mistaking them for rats and trapping them or poisoning them. And research led by the University of Glasgow has shown that water voles do better on these grassland sites. So this would be parks, areas of rough ground, verges, grass verges by pavements even, or school playgrounds. They do better on these sites than do water voles by water. And Cranhill Park in Glasgow, for example, has the highest density of water voles in the East End, and that's 156 animals per hectare, which is also believed to be the highest density in the UK. Because these are an animal, a reservoir of animals, reservoir of water voles that could be reintroduced back into other parts of the UK where they've been lost due to predation by mink and the other problems that they face. But that's obviously providing that the mink have been controlled in the areas that are being reintroduced. There's also a need to make sure that the genetic makeup of the water voles being reintroduced to other areas of the UK is similar to these ones that are occurring in the East End of Glasgow. And I visited several of these water vole sites, but the most incredible one was right by the M8 motorway. And some of you might know the big Glasgow Fort shopping centre, which borders the M8. And on the side that actually butts onto the M8, there's a huge grassy buttress. It's like a grass cliff, a grass supporting cliff that was made. And this grass cliff is vertical, that goes all the way down to M8. It's full of water voles, and these voles are living an amazing high lifestyle, tenement living lifestyle, if you like, tenement living water voles. And I find that incredible, absolutely incredible how they've adapted to that. And they don't seem to mind the busy noise of the cars going past. And the south-facing aspect of this grassy cliff probably provides heat in the winter from the sun. So these guys, they're doing really well, very interesting, and it does raise the possibility that underground water voles live in many other parts of Scotland. It's just that people haven't discovered them yet because they're so hard to find. And with the M8, with its grassy margins, verges, it could well act as a corridor for water voles to move all the way across to Edinburgh, living a similar kind of existence. So all very exciting, just showing you how much more stuff has to be discovered in Scotland, even with our mammals, which we normally regard as being well studied. So that's kind of one feature of my book, I suppose, is to show that Scotland's amazing wildlife is not confined to the mountains, the hills, the coasts, the lochs. Our cities are great places for wildlife too. And that was the next stage of my journey, and that was to Edinburgh. Now, I grew up in Edinburgh, and my interest in wildlife was sparked by urban foxes. The house where I lived, it backed onto a railway line, and I'd frequently see foxes going about on the embankments. And there's just a great habitat for foxes to live. And you can see why. I think people often are overly precious about woodland, because often in woodland, the places that are most diverse, most rich in wildlife are the glades, the places where trees perhaps have fallen down in a gale, and where the sun can come through. And these railway embankments you get in Edinburgh and in Glasgow and other cities, they are like forest glades, if you like. They're full of brambles and wildflowers and plants. They're great places for songbirds to breed and to nest. And that attracts creatures like foxes. Garden lawns, a fox likes nothing better than to forage on a garden lawn for worms on a damp morning. And the bird feeders in gardens attract birds, it builds up bird populations. And the cities also have their own micro-environment where it's slightly warmer than it is in the surrounding countryside, and I'm sure that benefits some animals as well. And I suppose the important thing about these railway lines is they're corridors, they're conduits, wild conduits, where wildlife can thrive but also move from one area to the other. So effectively a fox in Edinburgh can go all the way from the centre of Edinburgh to the outskirts of the countryside without even crossing a road, because it can use these wild highways, these wild motorways. So they're very, very important habitats, railway embankments. The other place that kind of inspired me as a youngster, inspired my interest in nature, was nearby Wardie Bay in Edinburgh. Now, Wardie Bay is not a natural bay, it's bounded on the west side by Granton Harbour, by the Breakwater Granton Harbour, and on the other side by New Haven Harbour and Leith Docks. But when I was a youngster, a teenager in the 1970s, I used to love guddling down in Wardie Bay at low tide looking for rockpool fish and other creatures. Now then, it was an extreme hygiene hazard, and I remember turning over rocks looking for these rockpool fish, and there'd be bits of toilet paper, there'd be human excrement floating around because there was a sewage outfall pipe there, and it really was a severe hygiene hazard. But as a boy and as a youngster, you know, I was oblivious to all that, and I happily guddled around. I never caught any nasty diseases, but I was just totally inspired by the place. So I was very keen to go back to visit there for my book, just to see how things had changed. Another actually interesting thing, just going back to the 1970s, then you get huge congregations of sea ducks, eiders and scoters and other ducks would congregate off places like Seafield in the Firth of Forth, and they were attracted by the brewery waste, the grain that's being pumped into the sea then, and also by invertebrates that actually thrived on the human raw waste pollution that's going into the water. So I went back there just last year, trying to see, you know, what the differences were, if I could remember any differences, and I was amazed just how much wildlife there was there. The rock pools were brimming with all kinds of fish and all that kind of stuff. There were brittle stars, ragworms. I was catching rocklings. I remember in the past, eel pouts are very common. It's an elongated fish, maybe about that size. Didn't find so many of them. And there weren't so many mussels either. Mussels used to be very prolific in this part of the Edinburgh coast, but there were fewer of them. So maybe mussels were one species that actually thrived under the polluted environment. Another very interesting fish I found was a shanny. Now, shannies are quite common rock pool fish. They are small blenny type fish, and I caught one which was about this size, which is bigger than normal. Shannies are often maybe a bit smaller than that. But the amazing thing about shannies is they like to sunbathe. Surely not a sunbathing fish, but yes, they do. They like to be by the margins of rock pools where they lie in the sun, presumably to gain heat or to save energy. And you often see them doing that, and if you're rock pooling, walking along the intertidal shore, you'll see them suddenly scooting off very quickly from the edge of the rock pool under the water. Another name for the shanny is a sea frog, and that's a direct reflection of the fact that they can sometimes move from rock pool to rock pool, actually by crawling across dry land. and they can stay out of water for several hours, especially if they're hiding secreted under seaweed. So a very, very interesting fish. I always find rock pools, intertidal zone, just such an amazing place to be. If you think about it, the incredible threats, the threats animals face, they face from all kinds of predators. When the tide is in, they're facing predators such as bigger fish, cod and flounders and sea bass. And then when the tide is out, the next wave of predators come in, such as oyster catchers and curlews and turnstones and birds like that. So, and they've got to endure huge variations in temperature. During winter, when the tide is out, they face frosts, temperatures below zero. And in the summer, limpets must positively bake inside their shells on a hot summer day. So incredible wildlife is found in the intertidal zone. Very, very interesting, very tough, and just full of endurance. Now, the other thing I found of interest when I was down on the shore was a mermaid's purse. Now, this is the egg of a lesser spotted dogfish. It's an egg case. It's like a leathery capsule. Dogfish, lesser spotted dogfish now is more trendily called small spotted cat shark. I always call them catfish by mistake, but the small spotted cat shark. And I think cat shark's a much nicer name. Dogfish, the prefix dog in animal nomenclature often refers to some kind of, or plants naming as well, often refers to some inferior quality. So dog rose perhaps, or dog violet, because a dog violet is scentless. So I think small spotted cat shark is a much nicer name for the dogfish, but I find it actually very hard not to use the word dogfish because I was brought up with that term, and I largely use it still today. But the interesting thing was when I lifted this egg capsule, this mermaid's purse, off the small spotted cat shark and lifted it up to the sky, there's a developing embryo inside. And you know, here on the edge of Edinburgh, Scotland's capital city, there's just this amazing new life being created, a small shark. So that's fantastic how the seas have been cleaned up, and although there might be fewer species now, or fewer numbers of some species because of the pollution, now the seas are cleaned up, there's a much greater biodiversity, a much greater range of wildlife, which is just absolutely fantastic to see. One other interesting fact about Wardie Bay is it's Edinburgh's best site for fossils, and ever since the 1820s people have been fossil collecting down there. These fossils are well preserved in ironstone nodules, which are harder than the surrounding mudstone, and that's how the fossils are found once the mudstone erodes away. In the 1970s, the famous amateur paleontologist, fossil collector Stan Wood, he took a real interest in the site, and he did a lot of collecting in Wardie Bay at the exact same time when I was scuttling around in the rock pools looking for fish, and he found 15 different types of fossilised fish. Interestingly, Stan Wood would boil his rocks before examining them, to obviously because of the hygiene hazard. But that's such a precaution I never thought of back in my day. My wildlife journey then took me on to a trip to Ely. I love to do snorkeling. In my wildlife writing, I really like to focus on the underwater world. I've been snorkeling ever since a teenager, and I find it's just such a great way of opening up the horizons of what you see in Scotland. So in my book I went to Ely. It's a place, I call it Paradise Lagoon. It's my own nickname for the place, but it's a shallow lagoon when the tide is out. And it's a haven for wildlife, all kinds of creatures, lobsters, beelet anemones, flounders, two-spotted gobies. There's just so much life around there. So after Ely, I visited Glenfinglas in the Trossachs, and then Perthshire, the area around Loch Ordie, which has been long been a stomping ground of mine. Great place for ospreys and other birds of prey. Great place for beavers as well. We were talking about reintroduction translocation schemes before, although albeit the beavers in Perthshire are from unofficial releases rather than a coordinated official release scheme. And then I went on to Appin, which is an area that lies on the shore of Loch Linnhe, roughly halfway between Oban and Fort William, and I spent a lot of time on the Arshiel Peninsula there. And there I had a most amazing encounter with a pair of otters. I was actually exploring the oak woods that border the Arshiel, border Loch Linnhe, Scotland's own temperate rainforest, if you like. But just before I was entering the woodlands, I looked out to the sea across Loch Linnhe, and I could see a couple of dots out on the horizon. I got my binoculars out, and they turned out to be otters. Well, that was a stroke of luck. So I raced down to the shore. I went to a headland, and just by chance, one of the otters had caught a flounder. And both of them started coming inshore. That was just such good luck, because they could have just gone away or gone hunting somewhere else. And they actually came ashore towards me and landed their fish literally within 20 or 30 feet of where I was crouched down. Now, as I say, there's two otters, and this is almost certainly a mother otter and their well-grown cubs. Otters look after the cubs for up to a year. Cubs hang around for up to a year, perhaps even more than a year. So if you see two kind of otters roughly the same size together, although it could be an adult male and a female, much more likely it's going to be a mother and her cub. And it was very emotional watching the otters, how they hunted together, and the pair bond the mother and the cub had. And after they devoured the flounder, they rested for a bit in the sunshine. It was a lovely warm spring day. And then he went hunting along the shoreline, and it's like a beachcombing technique. They undulate through the shallows, through the seaweed, through the bladder wrack, and they use their whiskers or vibrissae to actually feel for fish just as much as the eyesight does. And it's a very successful hunting technique. You could actually see the otters snapping up rocklings and butterfish and other intertidal fish all the time. And then by chance, just by chance, I don't think either otter was paying attention to what the other one was doing. They went their separate ways. One went one way down the coast, the other one went the other way down the coast. And then suddenly the young otter realised it was by itself, and it started this kind of emotional, piercing, melancholy whistle. Where are you, mother? Where are you? And it was a very kind of moving thing to hear, a moving thing to see. And I write my book, I kind of felt like I was an intruder in their own private world, and tears actually welled in my eye at that moment. Otters, they must have lightning reflexes. I mean, I was talking about them just there hunting through the seaweed, and when I'm snorkeling, I often see flounders, and flounders will lie quite still, but when you get too close, they bolt away like a torpedo. So how an otter can stalk a flounder and catch one is mind-boggling, and I find it difficult to comprehend. After Appin, I went to Skye, the Strathaired part of Skye, which is in the south, the southern part of the island. And there, one thing I came across that fascinated me was there was these ruined houses, ruined croft houses, and each one had a rowan growing outside. And this is how nature and humanity have been interlinked for such a long time, because rowans were believed to ward off witches, and these rowans were planted there as a means of protection. And even today in parts of the Highlands, it's supposed to bring bad luck if you cut down a rowan outside your house. So I zigzagged back across the country again, and I took in places such as Foulshew in Aberdeenshire, the amazing Seabird cliffs just south of Stonehaven rather, great colonies of guillemots, razorbills and birds like that. And then I was in the Cairngorms looking for dotterels and ptarmigan, golden eagles, birds like that, mountain hares of course, and then across to the Moray Firth where I saw dolphins, and just exploring the vast array of amazing wildlife you find in these areas. But my next stage was going to the Outer Isles, the Outer Hebrides, and that was South Uist and Harris. South Uist is, and the Macra there, it's just such a special place, and if you haven't been there, I really recommend it. In my book, the first moment I was on the Macra, I wrote these words: polka dotted with the golden blooms of buttercups and silverweed, this wondrous Macra on South Uist stretched as far as the eye could see, a gleaming carpet of life that brimmed with the wild calls of breeding waders. This was heaven on earth, the air crystal clear, the sun shining warmly, and only the gentlest of breezes ruffling the grasses and abundant wildflowers. It's just such a moving place, a place that really grabs the soul. And there's so much wildlife around there. It's a very rich habitat. Macar is a Gaelic word which means fertile, low-lying, grassy plain. And the underlying substrate of the Macar is comprised of calcareous, rich shell sand blown in from the Middle Atlantic over the millennia. And of course it's been low intensity farms with crops and low intensity grazing over the years. So this has kind of protected the habitat and ensured it benefits wading birds in particular. Very good place for breeding dunlins, lapwings, oyster catchers, redshanks, birds like that. Of course, a very vulnerable habitat, and its future probably depends on agri-government support schemes to prevent more intensive agriculture taking place in places like that. But for my book, I was spending most of my time in Harris. I absolutely love Harris, a very dramatic landscape. Great mountains, fantastic beaches, Luscantyre, Scaristad, beaches like that. But I was staying on the east coast, which is more rugged. It's a more rocky area, and that provided the perfect opportunity to do more snorkeling. And the water was so clear there, and I came across so many interesting species. One very stunning species was the blue jellyfish. I was snorkeling into a cave, like a sea cave, and there below me, I was actually feeling a bit apprehensive. Normally I feel quite calm when I'm snorkeling, but the sea cave is a bit like the unknown, so I did feel a bit apprehensive. And then this blue jellyfish appeared, and it's just a pulsating, this umbrella bell, pulsating slowly like a beating heart. And it rises up and down in the water, and I presume this is probably a means of maybe gleaning, catching plankton. It's a feeding mechanism moving up and down. Quite often with jellyfish you'll see small fish swing around their tentacles, small whiting and other gadoid, cod-like species of fish. And they do this for protection, and incredibly they don't get stung. Not because they're immune to being stung, but because they're so agile they can actually avoid the stinging tentacles. So very interesting to see that. Another interesting creature I saw, it's an Isopod, so that looks a bit like a woodlouse, related to woodlouse. And it was a free swimming Isopod. It was swimming through the water, and it actually settled on my wetsuit glove and then crawled over my hands, my fingers for a while, before then swimming away almost in comical fashion. But there's so much else to see. There's lots of wrasse species such as corkwing and rock coot wrasse, which are very colourful. There was ballan wrasse. There are shoals of saithe, a cod-like fish, and pollock as well. Another most interesting creature I came upon was sea hare, quite a lot of sea hares, which I believe was a spawning congregation. They are very weird looking creatures. They're so called because they have two tentacles atop the heads, look a bit like hares' ears if you've got some imagination about you. But they're a mollusk. They have no external shell. And when threatened by a predator, they will release a kind of purple cloud of ink, a noxious cloud of ink, with a kind of mix of chemicals that confuses the predator, and it's a form of protection against being predated. They really are one of nature's most bizarre creations. A soft mass that crawls across the seabed, and they have like fleshy wings which they use to help them move over the seabed. And sea hares that graze on green seaweed tend to be green, and those that graze on reddish seaweed tend to be red. And it's quite, this ability to change colour is quite a common phenomenon among some sea creatures, especially those that live in the bottom. And with flounders in particular, it's amazing watching them on the seabed, how when they move from an area of light coloured sand, where they themselves match the colour of the sand, when they move to a darker area of rock, they themselves turn dark. After Harris, it was on to Sutherland, especially Assynt, the area around Loch Inver and Sulvin. A fantastic place to see all kinds of different creatures. Another good place for snorkeling, and I saw pine martens and sea eagles and all kinds of interesting stuff there. And then it came on to Journey's End in Shetland. Now I adore Shetland. I just love Shetland. You almost feel you're in a different country. I think it's because the Norse influence, the names, the landscape looks very different. It's treeless, it's quite stark in some places, but the coast is very stunning, and there's just so much life around there. And one of the places I visited was the Seabird breeding cliffs on Noss, which lies just off Bressay, just to the east side of the capital town of Lerwick. And the cliffs there, they tower to 180 metres high, and they're full of ledges. Because erosion is taking place at different rates, you've got these tiered ledges going all the way up, and it's just a mass of seabirds. Very, very spectacular. I went there on a boat trip, just a tourist boat trip, but it was a great way of getting a fantastic close view of the bird life there. And it's also there's a tragic story to tell, especially in the case of kittiwakes. When we were exploring the sea cliffs of Noss, there were kittiwakes, there were clusters of breeding colonies, but nowhere near the same number that there used to be. Kittiwakes at Noss have fallen by around 90% over the last couple of decades, and probably the main reason is down to climate change. The changing climate, the warming of our seas has led to plankton ecosystem shifts, which is resulting in a decline in the abundance and size of sand eels. Kittiwakes are shallow diving birds, so they can only really access prey such as sand eels and sprats, fish that live near the surface, and they don't have the same range of hunting that birds like guillemots and gannets have to their ability, who can dive deeper. And gannets have the other advantage, they can roam over huge areas from the breeding colonies to search for the biggest shoals of fish and the best fishing spots. And you can see the toll the bonxies were taking, the great skuas, the sea predators, the sea raptors around Shetland. They were taking on the kittiwakes. Now, of course, kittiwakes and bonxies have survived together since the dawn of time, but now, because there are fewer sand eels around, kittiwake numbers are declining. It means the kittiwakes are actually breeding in smaller and smaller groups. And when you're breeding in smaller clusters in the cliff, you're much more liable to predation. The youngsters are much more likely to be predated upon, because there's not the same kind of group protection you'd have with a larger colony of kittiwakes. So it's like a vicious circle, and kittiwakes are becoming scarcer and scarcer. And I mentioned they've fallen by 90% on Noss over the last couple of decades. And since the 1960s, the overall UK population has fallen by at least half. So there's these insidious problems, climate change that's happening in our seas, and in Shetland that's very, very easy to see in a most stark way. Sand eel populations, of course, were initially depleted by industrial fishing, and following a local chronic stock decline in Shetland, sand eel fishing around Shetland was banned in 2003, and currently there's no UK commercial interest in sand eel fishing. However, sand eel fishing does still occur by other nations in the North Sea, the Norwegians, the Danes, some Swedish boats as well. And they're fishing in areas like the Dogger Bank, and they're fishing off a closed protected area of the Firth of Forth as well. And sand eels, it's an industrial fishery, so it's for feed for agricultural and aquacultural purposes. But it seems to me it's madness in the extreme in this day and age that sand eel fishing can still be permitted in the North Sea, albeit not by UK vessels. And we kind of really need to move forwards, because with sand eel populations being depleted anyway by the forces of climate change, the industrial fishing that's happening is making the situation even worse. I was desperate to see orcas when I was going around Shetland. It's been a creature I've always wanted to see. And there's two semi-resident pods of orcas that live around the Shetland Islands, and there's a fantastic Facebook page. If everyone's been up to Shetland, if you look at this orca watching Facebook page, it actually gives you real-time information of where the orcas are. So I did scour the bows and the firths of Orkney, of Shetland rather, to try and seek out these orcas, but sadly I had no luck, despite with the help of the Facebook page. In fact, in the week I was in, the 10 days I was in Shetland, the orcas were actually scarce and were few and far between. However, after I finished writing my book, I had a really lucky opportunity. The crew, the skipper of a fishing vessel called the Resolute, which is a mackerel trawler. It is based in Fraserburgh. But it was based up in Lerwick for the end of the season mackerel fishery in October 2020. So I had this opportunity to go in the vessel, and I knew this would be a fantastic opportunity to see orcas. because I heard before that they are attracted by the mackerel spilling from the nets. And it's long been known that orcas will hang around these mackerel fishing boats seeking the rich spoils. So one morning, it was the end of October, early November, I turned up at Lerwick Harbour, went aboard the Resolute, and we sailed late one evening. And then the following morning, just at daybreak, we were about 18 miles southeast of Sunborough Head. The nets were shot, and then suddenly, from a sea where there's no orcas, orcas appeared everywhere. They were following the boats, and they were coming alongside the bows. At one time, even there was two adult orcas and a calf sandwiched in between. Now, one of the most amazing things about these orcas that I was seeing swimming off the Resolute, these offshore orcas, is that they are different from the orcas that hunt the inshore waters of Shetland, the Firths and the Foes. The inshore orcas, they eat sea mammals, seals and porpoises, for example. They specialise in them. Whereas the orcas I was seeing off the fishing vessel off Sunborough Head, 80 miles off Sunborough Head, they feed on mackerel and herring and other fish. So they are fish specialists, whereas the inshore orcas around Shetland are sea mammal specialists. And it's a very interesting behavioural difference in behaviour and ecology and how they live, because it's a bit like, you know, the Barnacle Geese I talked about earlier, how the Svalbard population, for example, winters in the Solway Firth, and the Greenland population will winter on the west coast of Scotland and Orkney. So and these big pods of offshore orcas, we don't know much about them, but sometimes the pods can comprise up to 100 individuals, and this has been seen not just in offshore areas of Scotland but also Norway. So there's probably a lot we need to learn about these populations and how they live and what they do. Another difference, orcas that feed on mackerel have worn down teeth, and researchers believe that this is a result of sucking up the fish one at a time. And this suction of sucking up each fish one at a time, combined with the abrasive qualities of seawater, actually wears the teeth down. And the inshore Shetland orcas, they show no such tooth wear. These are the orcas, of course, that feed on seals and porpoises. So with that interesting tooth thought with regards to orcas, I'll bring my talk to an end here. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative and give a bit of a taste of what I found on my wildlife journey, my Scottish Wildlife Odyssey. And I'd be absolutely delighted to take any questions anybody might have. Thank you.